is you're seeing, and what I would hope is that consistently we're spending about $20 million a year, year over year. That's when you know the capital plan is probably working pretty good, still not jumping around. It might jump around within different departments, but we're still able to fund about $20 million a year in capital. This plan here, I might create a capital plan that says we got to spend all this money, but I'm also have worked in the other side, all the funding that has to fund this capital over 10 years. It's hugely complex. It's hard, and I have to meet with each budget manager to understand, and we have to look at their reserve balances and what's available, and then is there grants available for 588 items on that list. I'm trying to help the departments come up with a funding plan. I can't do that in 4 months. I need more time, and we're gonna pull it together for the 10 years over the budget deliberations when I'm working with staff over the next few months. It's still not going to be perfect. What also this allows us to do are all those grants, the gas tax money that they want us to have allocated to projects, the 5.4, we'll have that allocated in here so we can prove to the granting bodies that we have reason to use this money. And that stops them from, saying, well, you're not using it. We need to take it back. A bit of a complication is gas tax money is under the EA umbrella. And if we allocate gas tax money out to projects, the EAs have to support that. They have to make a direction to actually support and want to do that. So right now, I don't have that built in because I don't want to assume what the EA directors want to spend their gas tax money on. So that's another meeting. That's another meeting we have to make sure that you guys have that. So it's another agenda item that has to come forward, and more work that we have to do to have conversation to make sure this plan. And then on top of that, I have filtered in the report just a bit about asset management and how this plays into our asset management strategy, and how we've delayed an FTE request for asset management until we can do a full analysis of what the organization needs, because they've been doing it in little bits and jabs to make sure they're checking the boxes. So we're gonna put together a formal strategy and thought, but in the meantime, look at getting a grant and moving some of the objectives forward over the next year. So there's a lot of pieces in play to try and make sure we're heading in the right direction. But this is, like I said, 1/10 of what I would like to bring you in a different format. So we can certainly, I could kill this is a very big file. If I go to the capital plan, my fear was if I went to the attachment, same as your fear. There's 10 years of numbers and it's all really tiny and it's hard to see. On here, I can zoom in a bit better on different numbers. What I think I want to do right now, I've talked a lot up to this point, give you an opportunity if there's any specific capital items that you would like to talk about. My intent here today was to show you the 10-year capital plan that we've pulled together and how we've done it and some of the thought process that's gone into doing this. We need another 2 months to even say that this is reasonable. Am I going to crash it? Oh, I didn't. Just so you know, the top up to here is all the capital requests, and working with the team, the other part was making this document consistent so people could look up their department's information. This used to be in 10 different documents. It's all been pulled into one. It's pretty complex to get everybody aligned to the same titles and abilities for us to search. Oh, look at that. Sorry, I
can make a comment, Carla. That's the first time we've seen that. I mean, that pretty well shows exactly, what's going on throughout the whole TNRD. I've never seen anything like this.
So,
and with an explanation of what it's actually for.
So what I've tried to do is give the team the ability to go and say, okay, for protective services, now that, like I said, this is a big file, hopefully it cooperates. So it brings up all of protective services. I can look by McClure, I can look by any department at my fingertips. I could tell you what we're looking at for Pritchard and what we're looking at for Pritchard over the, I don't want to go too quick, over the 10 years. So Pritchard Fire Department, there's different ways of my budget managers to work with this. So in creating this 10-year plan to bring to the board, I'm in the meantime trying to educate people on what capital is. Repairs and maintenance isn't capital, that have never been involved in this before. So my budget managers might be managing a budget. All the capital and all the 5-year projections were managed by one person. So there's a lot of training to understanding and then having people work and learn how to use systems consistently to align with the way finance needs to understand the information, which isn't the way generally operations might think of it. So, and not create 5 different systems. So that's what I've tried to pull into here. We can look up the different reserve funds. Right now I can see what reserves are being, funding different operations.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So 2029 Little Fort, 596,648. What's that?
What row is it on? Sorry.
Little Fort Department Reserve. You just went by it.
Oh, here.
Go to 2029. Everything's fairly static. Then it's 104 and then 596.
Yeah.
What's that?
Okay. So if we go back over here.
It just says reserve fund for Little Fort.
Yeah.
So it doesn't specify what the actual description is, but I'm guessing that's a new truck or something.
And this is where it's actually quite hard to create.
Okay, that's fine. You don't have to let me know.
No, it's right here.
Okay, I know that if we have that capacity, that's gonna go a huge way
So
for us to be able to explain to the public what's going on.
yeah, so there's 2 different pieces of contributed equipment, contributed assets. What I'd say is over the next 2 months, we'll be working down and making sure the description has more detail so you can understand what that is. Some of it, we had to take the historical data, say, this stuff is expired. It's supposed to amortize within 20 years. 20 years is in 2029. You have to consider that you're going to need money there. And that's super important because then in the operating budget, we can make sure we're transferring enough to reserves. And where you don't have the appetite to increase taxation enough to transfer to reserves, we have to decide we're going to borrow. Or then we have to push those items out further. And we're making a conscious choice then, not just ignoring the assets until they're like rearing their ugly head. Then we're making a conscious choice. But at the same time, I have to train each budget manager to understand what I'm looking for in that and how to use it. We're also filtering in facilities master plan data. So when I met with the library and we talked about, the individual departments, when the furnace was coming up for replacement, when the roofs needed to be replaced. So, and we're incorporating notes into this one document that says where we're getting that and how we're making those decisions. We've also built in a 3% incremental year after year inflation factor. But that's getting overwritten. If one of my departments knows that the cost of that has tripled, they're layering that in so they can overwrite what we've put in there. But it was forcing them to think about all the things that they might not think about every day. It's a lot for some of these budget managers right now, who could be also new in their position. And then 2.5 months out of the time that I'm working on this, they're in the EOC and not available to learn. So there's a lot of intricacies with the work that I'm doing. I just want you to know everything in the TCA is available here. There's hidden rows that if you wanted to know historical information, I could open up the history and I could answer your questions on that. But of course, we want more detailed information than contributed equipment.
Good, thanks.
So there was a lot of information on here. I did not think we would be able to talk to it all. I did not think we were going to make meaningful decisions here today. I really wanted to give you, because I was trying to meet a commitment that was there. I wanted you to understand the level of work that's going in, all the information, and it certainly is great to understand that you want more summarized information. Like, and if you want to see, you know, 5 of the top items on this list, the challenge I have is if I showed you 5 of the top items in protective services, I would eliminate a large number of the smaller fire departments. You would only see a few of the fire buildings that are being built, right? So it is a bit tricky because there's so many services within protective services that I'm trying to bring you the information. And then all of a sudden I show you a summary and Director Laird doesn't get to see then what's happening in his department. So all of a sudden I'm eliminating something that's of interest to somebody else. So it gets a bit complicated. So right now the safe thing is I'm just giving it all to you. I just want to be able to do it in a way that I can give you answers really quickly. But my intent would be to give you a summary that you could quickly go and refer to the backup pages of the information. That's really all I had for the capital presentation, unless you had specific questions about items that were on there. My hope is that when we do our workshop, we would be able to do departmental presentations and then talk a bit about what the capital, because all the board won't have seen this until then. So come up with a way to give them an example of the capital plan and the financial plan that's there. Like I said, this would be somewhere in the middle of November that I would be targeting to do this before what I would hope would be the next finance committee meeting, which we will talk about. I have one more discussion point and then we'll get into the next meeting date. So.
Any other questions? Director Stamer?
Thanks, Madam Chair, to Ms. Fox. Looking at this, and I'm certainly not trying to step on any EA toes, because they have different wants and wishes than we have. But reading through your notes, it looks to me like we've got to make sure that we have that continued cooperation between the EAs and the board when it comes to identifying these capital projects, because if we don't know ahead of time what the long-term capital projects are going to be, somebody at the provincial level could say, okay, now we don't want to have individual EAs being responsible for that money. We're going to let the regional district do it. So I can see somebody trying to change this if we're not sure that everybody's on board, so that, you know, again, if the EAs are, you know, basically in control of a certain amount of money, that everybody else is on board with that. And so that we don't have any issues, because just reading through this, it looks to me like if there is any friction, the province might just decide to change that and basically give the money to the regional districts and then give it out to the EA. So I'm just, like I said, I'm not trying to step on any EA toes. They've got different funding. They don't have a lot of funding sources when it comes to improvements in their areas, but just reading your notes, it kind of gives me the impression that if we aren't able to work together and have these capital projects, you know, set up, that there could be changes in the wind. Am I correct on that?
Thank you, Chair Bass, through to the Director Stamer and the directors. There's been a strong indication that UBCM and some of the granting bodies are really watching to make sure that you have allocated the funds that they're giving to you to projects. And they're really pushing, because they've seen a gap, to make sure it's going towards core infrastructure. And the intent is to make sure something on your capital plan. Something was telling me to stop talking. So we want to work with the EA directors to make sure, and part of the reason for changing the policy to make sure requests were coming a year in advance were so that we could properly support those projects and show them in our capital plan. And it does become really hard when we have a list we've never shown you and there's 600 items on it. And then all of a sudden we're funding capital that's not even on our capital plan. That does become hard, although we know there is a need. that needs to be addressed there. But we also need to consider and hope that the EAs are considering the capital that is on this list.
Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just through to Director Slimer, we've just updated our policy around community improvement fund. It's a very clear operation on how we spend our capital. But when you look at some of the costs of doing projects, sometimes you don't have enough money even to put it into the capital cost. So it has to stay in reserve to cover the cost of a larger capital item, because every year we get topped up with a little bit more money. So you might have a $300,000 capital works project that you want to do, but at that particular time, you only have $250,000. So you have to wait for the top up to come so you can actually start the project. So that's where the reserve funds are, and each EA director has their own funding and their own line item on where their community funds are at, and how much is allocated and how much there is to spend. So it's very well laid out now. And I think all the EE directors do understand how the process works. So that's it's doing quite well right now.
Any other questions for Director Renier?
Thank you, Chair. CFO Fox, thank you for the presentation and the explanation. I'd like to wonder if you could bring up the summary page, which I'm a big fan of, actually. But before I talk about that, I'd like to make the distinction that you've brought up today, or at least for me, an understanding that there's a lot of back of house issues that haven't yet been dealt with. You can't do planning if you don't have the back of house in order. So I think the takeaway for me is that you still have back of house stuff to do. You're being interrupted in getting that done because of EOC operations. So I think CFO Hildebrand, I know that you've said you're going to take a look at how we resource those things. I understand from earlier meetings that we get paid by the province when we declare EOC, and maybe we should be looking in the future to be hiring third parties instead of extracting from our back of house that we're I guess behind on the back of house. So my comments about this, which I'm about to make, are from a planning perspective, fully understanding that until you've got back of house sorted out, this planning stuff is secondary to that. When we look at this spreadsheet, and Director Stamers had a comment about this spreadsheet, I asked you actually for a copy of this spreadsheet, as you know, and my intent was to make it even more useful from a planning perspective, from the director's perspective. So I'll give you some insight. I didn't print it out today, but I was able to take this spreadsheet, put a column on the far right side that's totaled, so we knew what we were spending per department, as you've correctly pointed out, per department for the total 10-year period. I was also able to put in for each one of your columns, I was able to take this and then, because it's in $1 million, just put it in millions of dollars so that we have 1.4 as opposed to 1,440,000, so on and so forth, so that I could create new columns. And I wanted a column for each year that showed the percentage of where we were in the year and where we were in the total. So for instance, I was able on one page, again, one page summary to show in each year what the percentages of utility, protective services, administration was, and what the overall number was. I was then able to highlight each one of those percentages to say, where are we spending the bulk of our money? It was quite revealing, and I'm going to send you that. I'll copy the directors of what that visual presentation was. But this is where we're talking about taking the raw data and then turning it into a document that directors who may not know finance could simply say, bang, that's the number where things jump up. Why did it jump up? Then you get to drill down and you say, well, let me go through the connectivity down to the Vavenby Fire Department or whatever it is. This is how that comes to that number. So what I'm saying is that from a planning broad picture basis, we can take the thing that you just created in the last week and make it even better, more useful, more productive for the EA people. I think we're all trying to row in the same direction. And that's the point about something like this, the summary, where we can quickly say, boy, there's a big jump that takes place from here to here. Why is it? And by color coding things and by putting priorities onto it, it makes it that much more intuitive to understand. So thank you for this direction. My hope is that we can help you get us further down this road when you've got that back of house issue sorted out.
Anyone else? CAO Hildebrand, then Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and to Director Grenier, thank you for those comments. I appreciate that. I know we will continue to work on making improvements and get better. You did mention about the EOC, and I just wanted to bring that up as some clarification. I wish we could just farm that out to a third party, but they would not know our region whatsoever. There's so much knowledge and skill within our team that when we're working with BC Wildfire, we're working in different electoral areas, we need that in-house knowledge and capability in order to react to a fire. And I wouldn't want to pass it over to, a third party to deal with our residents. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page about that. I know you brought up how we would better staff the EOC, and that's a huge issue that I just haven't been able to figure out, because it's the same in every municipality, every regional district, because there is nobody else that we could bring in and actually do the job that we're doing, because I feel like we're doing an amazing job at the EOC, but then something has to give.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. My comment was in response to Carla Fox's comment that she had to get back up to 2022. I think she said EOC numbers, that hadn't been done yet. So that's I thought perhaps a financial model where we could bring in a third party to say, these were our costs in 2022. They're on a ledger somewhere and we need to get that sorted out and filed in. Not the day-to-day, I know where this Logan Creek Road is or whatever it is. I get that point. It's just ways that we could get our back of house back on track on a timely basis.
And we did take advantage of that. And we actually had the EMCR actually fund a position to help us catch up, because it was all emergency related. So we did take that and move forward. So there's lots of other things to do. I just want to make sure I understood your comment.
Jamie?
Thank you, Chair Bass. I just wanted to chime in on this good discussion, and specifically about the discussion and comments of trying to simplify and make it easy to understand and digest. And I don't disagree with that. I think that's good and it's important. But I think we need to remember, and even when it comes to communicating with the public, it's never going to be as simple to explain the regional district budget as a municipality budget. Municipality has one budget and one taxpayer. We have 144 budgets, and depending, pick any spot on the map, they could be participating in different services. So the caution is that we don't want to oversimplify it, because every taxpayer is impacted differently. So we could say, oh, we're projecting on average taxes to go up by 3%. We could still have a handful of properties that goes up by 30% if we're not careful and looking at those numbers. So even though I understand this discussion, I agree with it, at the end of the day, there still needs to be very specific discussions with targeted directors who are their residents are impacted around those services. And it may be, when looking at these numbers, something that you would never even flag by doing these general overviews. It might be only a $20,000 increase. Well, a $20,000 increase in a utility that has 16 connections is huge, right? Or a $100,000 increase in the solid waste budget that everyone pays into is a very insignificant change. So I just want that to be, I just want to make that comment that we need to find a way to balance that. And I guess, yeah, to hit home that unfortunately, as much as work we can do, it'll never be as simple as when the city of Kamloops says, okay, budget's in, it's going to be a 2% increase. It'll never be that simple for us, because the nature of regional districts and the nature of our services.
Director Stamer?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, to Jamie, I appreciate that, Jamie, and I understand what you're saying on individual, you know, parts of the TNRD, but my point was more along, you know, when we start getting into major capital expenses, whether we're going to be building a new library or whatever we're going to be doing, that's, you know, that affects our overall budget more than that $20,000 line item. And Director, whoever is in that one area where there all of a sudden there is going to be a significant hit. Director Hayward had a 10% increase this year because of the changes in the appraisals, because the appraisals were so far behind in area O. So yeah, we know that, and we you know, hopefully we're all up to speed on that. But again, because there's so many services that are being provided, and some of them, you know, impact the entire TNRD versus some of the other ones, we should be spending most of our time on the big ones, the big ticket items, not the small items. And I certainly wasn't suggesting that we don't have that data available like we have in the past. I know it's labor intensive, but when we get to the point where we're making these decisions, it's better to me to have a summarized and listening to your report than it is to spend an hour and a half, you know, getting lost in the weeds. And that was just kind of my point. And especially at a committee level, you know, it sure helps out when we only meet every 3 or 4 months to be able to have these types of frank discussions and be able to make sure that when we do present it to the board, it's a finished product.
I would note that we have 20 minutes left of our scheduled amount. I don't have a problem with going long, although it does offend my belief in short meetings. Do you want to continue, Mrs. CFO Fox?
Thank you, Chair Bass. I think what I have should be able to fit depending on the amount of questions. So I'll just, as long as we're good to continue on past the capital, you kind of know my intent and my plans with that. I need more time, so I'm begging for more time. And I did put a lot of weight on EOC. We have a perfect storm. We have turnover of staff and lack of knowledge of current systems, because 1 to 2 people were doing a lot of that, and that was gone. So we're trying to rebuild that. And then we have a finance team that's committed and working very hard with antiquated systems, and, you know, more efficiency we can add, and bringing on key players. So intentionally waiting to hire the right people. So sure, I could have probably fit somebody in February. I wanted the right person, and it's paying off in spades. But I got to make sure that that person now who's taking on this huge weight is also being supported and has time. So there's a lot of, when we're trying to change a culture and change systems, you don't want to make the people that are doing the work and have been there feel like what they've done was for naught. I was quite confident that the financials were being recorded appropriately, and we were able to do the reporting. It's the system, we waited too long, and then things started to become irrelevant and very hard to keep up with, and we needed more people because the world's moving faster and everybody wants information more quickly. Everything's moving faster. We have to keep up with the time. We have a change in focus, and we're focusing and building within our ranks continuous improvement. Somebody that's responsible for continuous improvement. So as you said, I always use the phrase, we've got to make sure our house is clean. We have great members of our house. We're just trying to make sure everybody is staffed and equipped. And I always say, people come before the work. If I don't take care of my people, and if we give you holidays, why wouldn't we let you take holidays? But we don't have the redundancy and the cross training to give people that feeling. So the culture part takes a lot of time. And I think we're headed in the right direction. And I think we're going to start feeling like there's a lot more momentum in the steps we're taking.
Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that explanation. When do you think, like we've talked about November and we've talked about this back of house stuff getting caught up, is it reasonable that you would be caught up by November? And when would you be ready to begin receiving input on planning suggestions and ideas that don't interrupt with that back of house issue?
You know, I'm gonna be honest, I think that if I can deliver a budget to you accurately, the way I did last year with making a few changes, including the capital, separating the capital out, I will have achieved a lot. If you want me to achieve more than that, give me another staff member, another person like me that can do the same work. Because there's a lot of changes that we haven't implemented yet as far as purchase orders, electronic bank reconciliations, elimination of all check, making sure the hospital district is EFT, not checks. There's a whole bunch of items still on the to-do list for those sorts of things. That was my long answer. Short is if you guys give me some feedback along the way as we're building this next budget. By December, hopefully I can bring you capital separated from operating and it's accurate and within a tax rate increase that you can accept, knowing the state of the things that we're in right now. That's going to take a bit of work, and we've not done these departmental budget update presentations or budget variants to the board before. So we're working again with our team who are burnt out over the summer, no holidays, and now moving into budgeting, capital budgeting, and I'm expecting them to learn how to do new systems. So there's a lot of pressure on that staff just to do what we're doing now. And still I'm trying to work with Colton to enhance how we're communicating. I'm working with other information from other municipalities, looking at their great presentations and how they're presenting to make sure I can present the same information in a better way. That's not really doing anything different. I would say that if you want to see big changes, they're not going to happen until after March. And that's if we took 4 months to do a year end, that should have taken a month. We need, and I was down to key staff. So we need to fix that. So I'm not behind again 4 months with my staff and trying to bring you budget variances. Right now, I don't feel confident that this year big changes can be accomplished. I'm going to be striving to try and meet the changes that you've requested so far.
How much would this person that you described that get you caught up with these accounts receivables and whatever, how much would that person cost? And would it make sense, given your earlier comment, to just simply go to the board and ask them to fund that additional person? Because I don't know how we're going to get to planning if we can't even do the back of house.
Yeah,
Now, Hildebrand, I see you
sorry.
moving forward.
Thank you. The problem is finding the person, because we don't settle anymore. We need to find the right person. So when we're doing interviews, and we know this in all municipalities, the city of Kamloops, I'm sure Chair Bass can speak. They've got vacancies everywhere. We've got people that we can't fill roles because we just don't have the workforce out there right now that are going to meet our needs. So that's always going to be a challenge, but I wouldn't want to jump ahead unless we have a plan and a strategy set up by just asking for a position. I'd rather be able to defend it and justify it. And that's kind of the process that we're working through right now. And so that'll be coming to the board, and I'll talk a bit more about it tomorrow in our closed meeting as well.
CFO Fox.
Part of the intention that because it was 3 positions senior that we held off filling the other one is because I didn't really understand what we needed. That took a long time to just get to that 3rd position that's now posted. And I agree with CAO Hildebrand, of course, that I appreciate your hearing me and the support. And maybe the takeaway is we really look at the capacity and the structure that we have right now. I don't want to bring someone on and then that certainly not be the need in the long term. So for sure, need to be thoughtful about that. Also onboarding a new person to learn to work within our environment. I mean, I think Erin started in April and she might be getting comfortable with some of the things that we're doing. So onboarding does take a bit of time at that level.
Director Thorpe.
Thank you. Can we maybe just, considering how much has happened in the past year, like just how far forward finance has come, can we maybe just give them time to implement some of these things that they're still working on and maybe not put any more demands on finance? Just let them get their back of house or whatever it is caught up and maybe look at this after we get the budget done going forward for the following year? Because it seems like we're putting an awful lot of stress on people that are already under stress and they have made leaps and bounds at this point. Just a comment.
I actually think that's a great idea because as Director Stamer and Director Laird have said, we're seeing things that we never saw before from past terms. Basically, I think that CFO Fox and her staff have recreated our finance department, but they've still got quite a ways to go. And I'm just stunned at them. I mean, you say you're not getting anything very much done. I'm stunned at the amount of work you've got done. Literally stunned. Go ahead.
Thank you for your support and comments, Director Bass and Director Thorpe. My kind of initial thought here is I don't want to discourage the new ideas. I think having a wish list of things that I can understand, and as you bring them up and give me suggestions, I keep track of those items. I don't want to discourage you, and as you have ideas from bringing those up, just some understanding that we understand our workloads and what we're trying to manage. And some of the things might take us longer to deliver. And just having your understanding with that.
You ready to go to the surplus stuff now?
If everybody else is ready, I will move on.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Okay, thank you. So this is one of the items that's verbal. You're not getting any data. I tried my darndest to focus on this. Part of the issue is, of course, capital demands, the funding strategy from that. Have your capital plan in place, then you'll understand what you need for reserves, and you can put together a strategy to make sure that your operating plan is properly funding your reserves to pay for projects and capital projects. So because I'm not fully completed with the capital plan, the funding plan we're working on, the reserve strategy, which is essentially right now, ensure that we can fund the capital reasonably and have enough, because right now, if you looked, which I didn't have time, but if you looked at the reserve schedule, right now I've tagged different funding sources for different projects. The reserve schedule is dipping into the negative all over the place. We can't present that. That is work we have to do, but that's to give you an example of we're working through trying to identify, do we have reserves? I've put the plan together. I actually haven't been able to go through it in detail with the department heads. So the surplus is on the heels of that. To me, the surplus will be looked at. What I hear and what I understand is that we acknowledge that the surpluses seem like they're too high. We want reasoning behind them, which I can guarantee almost every surplus that I've questioned my budget managers on has been explained. I printed out a a surplus list for 2023. Total amount of surplus is about $5.6 million that was carried forward from the previous year. But a large number of those totals are practice that were followed with reason. If I think of development, building standards and planning services, because of the volatile economy, keeping the surplus in case the revenues dropped out because things were fluctuating so quickly was part of their previous strategy. The strategy we're taking now is let's have that money, but we're going to put it in a reserve fund. But there was also an understanding that we needed to create a capital reserve bylaw for every capital reserve we have. I have since questioned that, looked into that. The team has looked into that, and that is actually not the case. That saves a lot of work. And they were creating reserve bylaws to take money out every time. So that's going to help save us time to be able to manage this stuff without creating bylaws. Although there is an intent to creating a reserve bylaw to make sure you're using it for the appropriate things. So I see that intent, but having an overarching policy or bylaw that guides the use of reserve funds is probably more beneficial for the state that we're in. So I'm looking at that, but that took some investigation.
Director Stamer.
Oh, no, thanks. Oh, thanks, Madam Chair. I'd like CFO Fox to continue, but I had a comment on that, but yes, please continue.
Okay. So setting up that reserve strategy and policy kind of is going to come on the heels of that capital planning. These surpluses that are in there with development services, I think there was about 540,000 with building standards, 450,000 with planning. Those are large totals in there. I'll just go through my list quick here. Library, 942,000. That money was, it's capital seed money that they were keeping in the budget year after year. So if you looked at the capital, so in the expenditures, you'd see library capital project, and in the revenue, you'd see surplus there. Part of that surplus is being used to fund that capital that was on that budget. So it's not for naught, but a different way of looking at that is let's transfer it to a reserve and let's hold it there for seed money. And then if we have to do a budget amendment mid-year, we have to do a budget amendment mid-year. And let's move these capital projects that we're actually not doing, but we're just trying to hold them out of the operating budget. So it doesn't look like we've committed to doing capital that we just aren't doing. And we'll know that they're on the plan, but they're not being initiated. There's items like that. So we're going to work, we intentionally are going to work to fix those items and transfer money to reserve. We already did that partially in planning, and we do have a large transfer to reserve. So you will see the surplus drop there. I'll pause here. I have a few others, but I'll certainly, I've saw a couple hands.
Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that explanation. And let's just use your example, that planning department. We've built up a reserve. I heard, I think the two numbers that you talked about were 900,000. My recollection from meetings before was that we have about 1,600,000 in reserve for the planning department. You look at this summary number here for planning department services, and you'll see that we don't have, in the next 10 years, we don't have a large amount for planning department. So I asked the question before, from an operational perspective, if everybody stopped building today, how much would that planning department cost us to run for a full year? It's about $500,000, $600,000. So if we've got a 900 to 1,600,000 reserve, we have asked the taxpayers, we have collected from the taxpayers surplus money that we may have a plan for in the future, but we haven't asked them for that. Those monies were collected from the taxpayers to fund the planning department. And if we want to move it to some other reason or some other rationale, we need to account to the taxpayers how we're doing that. I get that we're in the process of moving towards that and put it to taxpayers or directors or whatever, but I don't think that we can assume that all the money that we've collected in reserve should automatically go to some other department. I think we have to revisit with these planning tools and say how much of it goes back to the taxpayer. And if we want to build a library, if we want to build a utility, if we want to build whatever it is we want to build, then we take this kind of information. We say, here, taxpayer, here's the justification for building this library in the 5th or the 6th year. Not sort of build up a fund for the last 10 years and then say, oh, that's where we're going to put it. We're going to put it to library. So I get the planning perspective. From the EA or from the political perspective, we have to go back to our taxpayers and account for these surpluses and whether we keep them or whether we give them back. In my opinion, that's an opinion.
Director Stamer, did you want to speak on this, or should we let CFO Fox answer first? CFO Fox?
My speaker's not on. Thank you. So number one, coming in, I saw surplus as an issue. However, I'm here, I'm new, and there's a lot of educated, smart people I work with that make decisions. So I certainly, number one, don't want to assume. So I have taken the last year to work with my staff to try and understand. However, we haven't gone back to budget conversations, so I'm starting more informed to get into these discussions. So please let me work with the department heads to understand why they were there in the first place. Planning and development surpluses were created for operating, not for capital. That's why it's not on here. All these numbers were presented and approved by the board. So it was intentional decisions being made by past board approving the numbers that were there. And they followed a process and a system that was accepted back then. We're looking at changing that. I want to seek to understand. I don't want to make assumptions with my staff and think I know more than they do. I do understand that financially it doesn't look the best when we have all these surpluses. I need to understand further and I'll work with the team. Right now, what I'd like to do is commit to a 10 to 15% contingency on budgets, looking at returning. Now, legislatively, all surpluses that are created go back to taxpayers every year. And it goes back as a revenue on the budget. But I think what Director Grenier is looking for is an intentional reduction of the expenses for the amount. I will work with the staff to try and intentionally reduce where I see that there's gaps and variances where I think we can reduce. And when we present back to the committee, hopefully I am able to bring you a report that says we've been able to reduce these contingencies down. But remember that some of these numbers have capital and I'm going to have to do transfers to reserves to move the monies that were committed and being used for capital projects that were earmarked for capital. So I will work on it. I'm aware of the issue. I think I understand that we want a more reasonable contingency. We don't want to carry these surpluses. We're going to move some of that money that's in surplus to the reserves where it's legitimate. You guys will be given a report on to what's happening with those surpluses when I am able to bring that information back to the Finance Committee, hopefully in November.
Director Stamer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I like CFO Fox's explanation. And I disagree with Director Grenier in a couple of points. We're not specifically asking our taxpayers to pay $2 a year for planning. It doesn't work that way, right? It's not an exact science when we're trying to build these budgets to supply 144 services. And yes, I know we don't want to be running surpluses forever, but I mean, let's face it. Sometimes all of a sudden, I'll give you a quick analogy of how it can also work together. We could buy a brand new truck in Barrier for $750,000. 30% of that budget will come from Area O, 70% will come from the municipality of Barrier. 10 or 15 years later, that truck is basically no good to us because it's too old. So then we sell it to the McClure Fire Department. How much do you think they pay for that truck? Beans all, right? Beans all. So we're all in this together. So I don't think that we have to worry so much about, whether we've got a few extra bucks in one or more accounts. I think the main thing is being able to determine what we're going to need in a 5 and 10 year capital plan, what amounts of money we can put into reserves. And if we need to have a little bit of flexibility, so be it. We do the same thing in Barrier, in as much as that if we have money that's going aside for a truck, it's going into the reserve, it stays in the reserve. But there may be a portion of that budget we may need a little bit of flexibility on. Maybe we want to put an addition to the hall. So maybe 20% of that budget goes into a surplus, so that we have a bit of flexibility and we don't have to change the bylaw to get that money out because it was supposed to be for a truck. So I know I'm kind of oversimplifying it, but I think, I don't want to get caught up into that. If CFO Fox is going to be giving us a rundown on variances in each individual department, we start finding that, we're charging too much money for dog fees or whatever it is, then that's fine. We should have some flexibility. But as directors, we are making that decision on behalf of our taxpayers. And at the end of the day, in the 3 or 4 years that we're here, if they don't like the way we do things, that's fine. But I don't think I want to go back to my taxpayers and say, oh, I want to reduce your taxes by $2 because we had a little bit extra money in the planning department. That's just me.
And Director Grenier.
Thank you for that, Director Stamer. And I just want to address what you just said, because I think we are both wanting the same thing, but we have to be very clear. You want a fire truck because it's timed out. I get it. I want to go back to the taxpayer and say, we need this money for a fire truck. I don't want to say, oh, well, you know, we asked you for more than we needed for the last 10 years, so we're going to just now use that to buy a fire truck. I think that we need the fire truck. We can make the case for the fire truck. The planning department is not the place to pay for a fire truck. The planning department has a surplus of at least $1 million right now. It's operational. It isn't a capital plan item. It's not a fire truck. It's operations. We continue, even in the last year budget, to collect more than the cost is to run the planning department. And the rationale that that CFO Fox and I have had is, well, we may come across a time when the planning department doesn't have as many building permits and we got to run the operations. Yeah, so what's the operations? If nobody built anything for a year, it'd be about 500,000. And if we've got 3 times that in a reserve, maybe we ought to stop asking the taxpayer to fund more than it costs to run the planning department. This is the creep that happens not just in government, but in businesses too. And we, as the new board, need to make sure that our systems are set up to catch it and that our default mechanisms, 15%, you'll see in my circulation, I said, use 15% as a default. Use 10%, use 20%, but at least have a default number so that we're not gouging the taxpayer for an unassigned amount of capital. I want the fire truck as much as you do, but I want to say to the taxpayer, we want this money for a fire truck, not just we want money and we'll tell you when we need to use it. That's the difference.
If I may, and supplement, I totally agree with you. We're on the same wavelength. And I think CFO Fox has mentioned that when we look at these discrepancies, particularly in operating expenses and things are out of whack, we should be, as a committee and as a board, to be able to readjust that. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that we need an additional $400,000 because the provincial government's going to download a whole bunch of BS that we have to now be responsible for the OC, and we're not going to be able to recover the costs that we incurred this summer on all the extra work that we had to do. So now, instead of asking the taxpayers to be able to now additionally fund that $400,000, we as a board have decided that we are going to take $400,000 out of that planning budget, and that is now going to be earmarked for finance. That gives us an opportunity to be able to adjust that budget on recommendations from staff and also on recommendations from the board. So you and I are on exactly the same wavelength. I'm not looking at trying to expand government, but at the same time, we have to be also flexible in our planning. And I certainly don't want to see the valleys. I want to be able to see a consistent plan with our 5 and 10 year plans that we've been looking at, so that we do have, you know, if there is any bumps in the road, we're not going to be asking the taxpayers for any significant increases now or in the future. So I think you and I are on the same page with that.
CFO Fox.
Thank you. Just really want to reiterate that, because some of the things I'm hearing may leave people thinking that we mix reserve funds. We do not legislatively, all reserves are kept within the fund they belong to, unless I guess there was an intentional decision from the board, but the staff does not mess with the reserves. They're managed independently of each other. Number 2, staff have not packed away surpluses. Surpluses legislatively are brought back into revenue in each service and reduce the amount of taxes that we charge for that service. If the development services surplus was removed, taxes would go up over 55%. It's a large percentage right now. So yes, we might remove the surplus, reduce the expenditures, and it would have a nil effect. So I just want to remember, when we're giving this information into the public, I don't want to leave them with the thought that staff intentionally move surpluses or hide them away. We follow legislation.
Thank you. Cognizant of the time, more for your surplus discussion?
The only thing I ask is for the next meeting date, we have November 22nd as a good day where there's another meeting. If you guys were willing to have that as the day, we would either then get rid of the one in December or just leave the one in December based on what your wishes are.
Well, it's not that agenda item yet, but let's move it up and decide now. Is that okay with everyone? That's okay. Okay, that's good with us. Thank you. And I guess we'll decide on December later because who knows, maybe we'll have other things to talk about. I'm on to Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a question on the capital costs and the operation costs. Now, we're quite aware of how they've been intertwined. Is that one of your things that you're going to accomplish this year? Is getting sorted out between capital and operation?
Thank you, Chair Bass, through to Director Laird. Even if I have to separate it manually, because it financially, I can't do that, I'm going to separate it manually for presentation purposes. It's going to be easier for me and for you for explanation and keeping it clean. So yes, it'll be I'll make every effort to have that separated.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to new business. Any new business? Director Grenier?
Thank you, Chair. So I circulated this to everybody, and I think in light of some of the things that we talked about today, I can quickly jump to a couple items. We touched on number 2, surplus reserve policy, and I think I heard you say that you would be happy as a default mechanism to go to a 15% number unless it's justified some other way. Is that something that you could, if we gave you direction to do that today?
I'll stop you right there because that would have to be a board decision.
So a recommendation to the board that is concurrent with the staff that perhaps we look at a 15% policy. If I want to settle on a number that you think is reasonable, that this committee might think is reasonable, that could recommend to the board so that we can show, at least in the planning perspective, we're taking this approach. I think that would be a constructive, useful thing.
Okay, my issue here, Director Grenier, is that this was dropped on us yesterday. And as Director Laird has said, and others have said, we need time to consider things. So I'm just wondering if we should put this off for now, because first of all, it's late. And I haven't had any time to actually think about what you presented because I was in City Council all day yesterday.
I am simply saying, Chair, that a few moments ago, CFO Fox said that she was considering a policy to get us to where we want to go, utilizing a 15% number. And it seems to me that if you're agreeable to the notion that you're looking at some sort of a default mechanism, I mean, there's always exceptions. There could be a very reasoned exception, but if the default approach is a percentage, we're quickly going to come to the 95 different silos and say there's too much in here or there's not enough or whatever it is. And that will help expedite the work. So I'm only responding to that. If it's not useful, then it's not useful.
CFO Fox, and I have a question. That would be the kind of decision that you might be making and bringing to the board? Or would you even have to have any discussion on it?
So first off, I didn't commit to a policy because I actually don't have time for policy. But what I did say is I committed to the finance committee that I would work with the team, the budget managers, to reduce the amount of surplus that's being created and try and work to a 10 to 15% contingency as was suggested. I don't think at this stage I would need the board's direction to do that because I think overall I think it's financially the right thing to do based on the information that I have. But what I would do is when I bring this conversation to the board, I would ensure that they understood all the things like I take in 3% consideration for inflation and those different things so that they would understand what I was doing with it. And at that point, when I bring that workshop to the board, they would then understand the factors that I've been using to develop the draft plan.
Thank you. Anything else with that, Director Grenier?
No, I have nothing else.
Okay, thank you. Any other member reports? Anything else from either of you? Then I'll declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.